Next is our final award, the Award for Imagination and Service to Society. Often this award goes to people in the science fiction genre. It is interesting how science fiction often gets it right in the big picture, but not always in the little picture. The Clarke orbit that we all love and marvel at envisioned space stations as these communication satellites. And while they are still by the ITU called space stations today, it is because it was envisioned that there was a man up there changing the vacuum tubes because they're always burning out, and it's not exactly the way it is today. Without further ado, our award winner is Kim Stanley Robinson, and I'm going to ask Sheldon Brown to come up here and introduce him and present him with the award. Sheldon is the director of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination at UCSD, and a very special person to us. We will not get to hear what we always love to hear every year about the progress of the center. Sheldon, by the way, happens to hold the world record in the Guinness Book of Records for presenting 117 view graphs literally in 10 minutes. So he will not do that tonight.
That's not true. But a couple of those other things are true. When I was thinking about introducing Stan for this award, I had a few different takes on it. That's kind of one of which started from the kind of very personal engagement and relationship that I've developed with Stan over the years, that has involved a number of collaborations on a number of kind of pretty crazy projects. Stan helped bring the performance artist Marina Abramovich to the Clarke Center, and we spent a week kind of wrestling around how we might, intersect the kind of ideas of the Clarke Center, the ideas that Marina had developed over 40 years of being a performance artist, and Stan's work as a science fiction author, into a set of cultural productions that went to the Venice Biennale and created a film and created a podcast, and a really interesting, artistically risky, and challenging set of things that we did together. So I think of the things that we've done personally together over the years. I think of the things that Stan has done to actually help us found the Clarke Center at UCSD. When we were going through this process of the back and forth with the foundation, I thought that all I had to do was say, hey, look, we made Stan Robinson at UCSD. Isn't that good enough to prove that we should be the place that has the Clarke Center? And so Stan is one of a cadre of notable contemporary science fiction writers that came out of UC San Diego, seemingly randomly, unintentionally. And part of the argument for the Clarke Center being there was to say, look at what happens here. Help us kind of marshal this and catalyze it into something that is able to continue the work that Clarke himself was doing between, as Tedson was talking about, the left brain and right brain application of human imagination. But those things are kind of, I don't know, they're almost kind of like, they're personal, they're kind of provincial in terms of the impact that Stan has had. But 50, 100 years from now, some of that might get noted in the footnotes of the record, but I think the things that will be certainly at the forefront of it is the impact that Stan's work has had broadly, culturally, socially, on how we began to undertake engaging the issues of profundity of our time, the existential issues that will create the legacy that we are giving to future generations. And this is something that our works of art and culture should do for us, right? So that, sometimes we think about art and we think of it as this, well, it's this frivolous kind of activity that we do when we have the time to do it or the time to be entertained. But art itself, I would say, is maybe the most important thing that we do as a civilization. It's the area and the arena that crystallizes what we think is the most important, the most valuable aspect of what we are as a species and as a civilization. And not all art does that. And not all artists try to take that on. But I think when I look at the work of Stan Robinson, I see that these questions, these challenges about what it is to be human at this time, what it is to sort through the mess that we've made of things, but also by drawing upon the things that are the most important, valuable, and virtuous in the human that will help us kind of move forward. So Stan's work is exemplary in how works of art can help us understand the situation and give us guidance to how we might move forward. And these aren't polemical pieces. These aren't ways that say, you must do this, like this, like this. But these are things that acknowledge that we are driven by our passions, that we are driven by our curiosity, that we are driven by our foibles and our failings, to try to kind of come up with a way to somehow sort through this mess, and to celebrate what it is to be alive and to thrive and to survive. So his work, so he's written 19, 20 novels. He's just given me his recent novel that's taking place in China because tomorrow morning I fly to China. And so this will give me a new lens to think about that experience with. His work involves themes that think about the importance of science and knowledge in sorting through this stuff, the fact that science itself is a social practice and that the scientist is a citizen in our society and is subject to all of the kind of stresses and strains of what it means to be a citizen. In fact, going back to looking at the person that first maybe was one of the people that kind of first put on the table what it is to be a scientist, to think about how Galileo did this in the 16th century, 15th century. Thank you. Get a historian to kind of nail me on the dates. But then also how the platform of imagination that science fiction offers allows us to put ideas on the table that have relevance to the here and now of this moment, but give us an imaginative platform to think about them. So one of his famous series of books is the Mars trilogy, where he looks at how we might go to Mars, might live on Mars, what we might do with that environment, geoengineering it, creating a new social and economic structure to inhabit that planet. And in a way, all of that is a stand-in for what our challenges on Earth are. It's not really to suggest that we have a planet B, but that how we might treat planet A, with kind of taking away the constraints and restrictions that we often put on our imaginations about how we think about our reality right now. And as I was thinking about this introduction, and I've introduced Stan, I don't know, half a dozen times over the last few years for different things. We do a lot of things together. He helps us in our project that we do that is a collaboration with the Bartlett School of Architecture, where we imagine the city of London in the next 50 years. But I went to the Wikipedia page, of course, because that's what you do when you need to give an introduction. You need to get your facts right. And so on the Wikipedia page, there's a part here that says, Sheldon Brown described Robinson's novels as ways to explore how nature and culture continuously reformulate one another. So I've obviously introduced you a number of times that now I'm actually part of your Wikipedia profile. But I thought it was a pretty good quote. So I'll repeat it here. I think, our civilization needs artists like Stan Robinson, and I'm so grateful to be able to give this award in the legacy of Arthur C. Clarke to Stan Robinson for imagination in the service of society.
Oh, it's so beautiful.
I guess I should hand this to you.
Oh,
And
well, let's show it to people. So beautiful. Thank you. Well, thank you, Sheldon, for that kind introduction. We have indeed been brothers in arms these last years, especially since the Clarke Foundation was so kind and wise as to make the Clarke Center be at UC San Diego, a truly great school in this world for science and the arts. So, and thanks to the foundation for this event, to Walda and Monica, to Diana and Tedson and everybody else involved with the foundation. It's been a thrilling day. It's good to meet Clarke's a Sri Lankan collaborator of all these years, and all the other things that have happened here. To meet his nieces, Angie and Judith, it's been a stupendous day. And I have to admit that it is a particular pleasure and a thrill to accept this award in the presence of my fellow science fiction writer, Buzz Aldrin. It's perhaps not well enough remembered, since I have been writing a science fiction novel about the moon, that it's famous, of course, that Neil Armstrong, when he landed, said, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But what Buzz said when he stepped down right after him was, well, that may have been a small step for Neil, but that is a wicked long jump from the last step on the ladder. And I'm thinking, this is humanity, that we have managed on the second phrase on the moon is a joke, and making sure that we are keeping our sense of fun about the adventure of life, a beautiful thing. I also was lucky enough to sit next to Buzz through a very long and boring meeting of the Mars Society Board of Directors back in the mid-90s, and a lot of you have been at board meetings and you know what I mean. And the whole time Buzz was drawing sine waves by hand in a notebook next to me. Sine wave, sine wave, sine wave. And finally, when the meeting was over, hours later, I said, Buzz, what's with all these sine waves? And he said, well, I'm trying to figure out the best way to get to Mars with the least amount of energy. It was the Aldrin cycle. And so we have the Hohmann orbit, we have the Aldrin cycle. And so I don't know if I was there at the very birth of the idea, but it was a fun way to spend an afternoon. And lastly, I want to recommend to you Buzz's autobiography, published about 10 years ago, so we need a volume 2. But this is a beautiful book, and he's well named as Buzz. And I read it in a hard time, and it was a great comfort and a great inspiration. So thank you for that. Now, I never met Arthur Clarke in person, but I got many a phone call from him during those years of the mid-1990s, because he had an interest in Mars. He published a book about terraforming Mars, Gardening Olympus, I think it was called, and he read My Red Mars and provided a blurb for it that no doubt helped its success in the world. And because he was in Sri Lanka and he was a science fiction fan, part of the science fiction community, he would often call people, and I was one of those people that he would call on the phone. And it was always a thrill for me because it was a call from the other side of the world, and he would say, hi, this is Arthur Clarke, and I'd say, oh, wow, how amazing. And one time, I had written a story called Green Mars that was about mountain climbing on Mars, about climbing the cliff that surrounds Olympus Mons. It's the biggest volcano in the solar system. It's 27 kilometers above Martian datum, the equivalent of sea level, which means that it's 3 or 4 times as tall as Mount Everest is over our sea level. And it's about as big as the state of Arizona. And it has a cliff all the way around it, an escarpment, a little bit of a mystery. And so I had written a mountain climbing story, kind of in the tradition of British mountain climbing of the 1970s, the Himalayan siege climbing that conquered Everest and all these great faces of the Himalayas. I did that on the cliffs of Olympus Mons. So I got a call from Arthur Clarke. Stan, did you see the latest photos of your mountain on Mars? I said, yes, goddammit, I saw the photos. And he started laughing. He said, Stan, you could ride your bicycle up that slope. And I had to admit that that was true. And this is what happens in science fiction. You know, you get the latest data, you write a story based on that latest data, and then some new findings come in that mean that, you know, things have changed and your science fiction has turned into an alternative history or a fantasy. So it was a pleasure always to be this period when he was calling me on the phone. Now, the reason that we're gathered here, the reason that we remember him, it's important, of course, that he was a working engineer and that he had a scientific background that was very strong, and he became a public intellectual that could explain science to the public, like Carl Sagan, like Isaac Asimov. But the reason that we are all really here is because he was a great science fiction writer. And this is why I'm particularly honored, because science fiction is a genre that your ordinary literature, the realism that is sort of the default literature of our time, is about human beings in relationship with each other. The 19th century big novel, the social novel, is about the relationships between individuals and their society and history itself. But what science fiction adds is the relationship between humanity and their planet, and also humanity and the universe itself. And this is where Clarke particularly shone. He was an inheritor of H.G. Wells and of Olaf Stapleton, 2 crucial British science fiction writers that he revered. And H.G. Wells wrote utopias stubbornly from 1905 to 1945. And I want you to think about those years as a period of 4 decades in which you write utopian novels over and over again and put them out there to no particular notice or no particular sales. But in 1945, at the UN meeting in San Francisco, at Bretton Woods, when they reconstituted the world order, a lot of them were Brits, and they were using H.G. Wells's ideas, the social welfare state of a scientific meritocracy. These ideas had floated into the substructure of world thinking. Olaf Stapleton wrote space fantasies that described the history of humanity and their successor species over millions of years. He has a 200-page novel that describes about 20 billion years, essentially the rest of the lifetime of the universe. An astonishing feat of prose poetry and one of Clarke's favorite writers. What is humanity going to become over the long haul of evolutionary history? And his book, Star Maker, was one of the very first Penguin paperbacks. And British soldiers in World War II were carrying that paperback in their pockets in order to keep themselves aware of the big picture as they were involved in the wartime of the little picture. So this is what science fiction can do for you in its portrayal of the relationship between the individual human and our society and the larger picture of cosmic history. So Clarke's books, you should look particularly at The City and the Stars, and even the title itself is very evocative of what he's trying to convey. A beautiful novel, a kind of prose poem. And then we know, most of us, about Childhood's End and 2001: A Space Odyssey. This universe is so big, there are other intelligences out there, almost certainly. We may never have contact with them, or the contact may always be mysterious and tangential. And this is what Clarke was really good at. His aliens aren't quite there. They're escaping out the doorway in Childhood's End. They're a monument somewhere on the moon in 2001. And in the Rendezvous with Rama, it's their spaceship passing by completely empty, coming through on the way from here to somewhere else in a complete mystery. So he wanted to evoke these other intelligences in the universe without getting into the extremely difficult and I would say impossible ground of trying to portray them as characters. A very smart move as a writer. And then he also when he was most famous, he wrote utopian science fiction, in particular Fountains of Paradise and Imperial Earth. And in both of these books, he tried to suggest that if we got through the problems of the present, if we took enough care of the Earth, that we would get to a point in time where we would have a solar system-wide civilization that was prosperous and peaceful and just. And so it was a technology for Clarke was interesting. He loved it, but it was a step towards justice. He was a peace and justice person. He was significant in the fight for peace against nuclear arms. And in the 80s, there was a famous split amongst science fiction writers, either for or against the Reagan Star Wars program. And he was one of those that cast most hilarious doubt on this, saying, well, all you have to do is cast a barrel of nails into space and the whole program is dead in an instant. So you can kill a $15 billion project with a $100 barrel of nails. How does that work? And they couldn't reply to him. He had killed them with a single joke. So Clarke was a force for good. And what we get now is a question of, well, what would he say to us now in this ever increasingly difficult situation? I can tell you pretty certainly what he would say is he would say utopia. He would, because utopia is an expression of our hopes. Dystopia is an expression of our fears. We have a lot of both right now, but you'll notice how many dystopias there are in our society right now because we have a lot of fears about how things are coming along. But to hold a utopia, like Wells did between 1905 and 1945, is a kind of moral obligation to say that if we did things right, things could come out okay and be better. And so, although there's fear in Clarke, it's always a fear of transcendence, it's a fear of the dark, it's a fear of the size of the universe when you realize it. He's not a simple writer, nor is he a Pollyanna, but he's never afraid of other people, of cooperating with other people. He would not ever have written a dystopia. He was a very open and generous person, and very playful as well. So he would be, at this point, urging us to take care of the earth, especially the oceans. He would be trying to work for peace and for justice. And I leave you with this thought. Here we are. This is the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation combined with the Arthur C. Clarke Center. There aren't that many kinds of organizations based around the work of a writer, and especially of his generation. You don't see a Graham Greene Foundation. Even as great a writer as George Orwell, you don't see a George Orwell Foundation, and yet you see an Arthur C. Clarke Foundation. Why? It's cheerful intelligence. That's what he was about. Thank you.
Okay, we're a little pressed for time, but we have time for one or two questions. Anybody?
Any questions at all? Up, there we go. Mike?
A very trivial question. When you're not reading science fiction, what other fiction or nonfiction do you like to read?
I like to read all fiction. I particularly love the Naval Adventures of Patrick O'Brian. Beautiful set, 20 novels. I recommend them. I recently read the Neapolitan Quartet by Elena Ferrante, a quite spectacular four-parted novel by an Italian woman. We don't know who she is, but she's a hell of a novelist. And really, I would say read anything, read everything. It's all interesting one way or another, bad or good.